Happy to join you this afternoon. Those of you who've had to put up with me in the past know that I standardly look at overarching threats, challenges, opportunities, and then I do a geographical spin around the world, and I will follow that same pattern this afternoon. The single greatest threat we face is still the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Relations with the 5 long-term holders of nuclear weapons remain stable. New arms control agreements with Russia are in the offing. Probably we'll hear about them in September. The real challenge are the evolving new nuclear powers. India and Pakistan crashed into the club, and now our focus is on North Korea and on Iran. I'll come back to this as I go around the geographic spread. It isn't the state ownership of nuclear weapons that's the scariest part. It's the potential that they might be acquired by international terrorist organizations. And indeed, terrorist threat remains the second largest threat, and it's that overlapping between the potential of weapons of mass destruction terrorists that has added to the anxiety about what they may be up to. First attack inside this country was in the first year of the Clinton administration. The second was in the first year of the George W. Bush administration. I am apprehensive in the absence of solid evidence that we could in this year see yet another attempt. There's a major effort to try to detect, track. We can come back to that in the question and answer period, but it remains a major hazard. The third one, international narcotics movement, has also gone through a substantial mutation. For a great many years, it was viewed by the rest of the world as a north-south problem in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. is the largest consuming society of illegal drugs, fueled a trade of almost unimaginable proportions in the money that's involved that flows. About 10 years ago, the international criminal syndicates, examining all that, concluded that there were underserved markets where they could get into this lucrative business. And so we saw the beginning of an east-west flow. Out of Colombia, so forth, across Venezuela, across to Africa, north to Europe. And now most recently from Afghanistan, flowing west, across Iran, and again toward Europe. Now, the only good news of all of that is that much of the rest of the world who considered this really just a U.S. problem now see it as a global problem as they find their own societies increasingly impacted. Fourth overarching threat has seen new drama that brings real life to it, and that's pandemic epidemics. We worried about the potential of disease spreading across continents because of the mobility of our societies. Swine flu has now brought, or pardon me, H1N1 has now brought that home. And the danger here is the speed with which of some stream of epidemic will become resistant to any of the known medicines. And therefore, as it makes its second appearance, 6, 8, 10 months after the first one, far more virulent. The speed with which H1N1 popped up in over 60 countries was pretty dazzling. Of the challenges, global warming, climate change, we hear much about it, read much about it. I have no definite description for you of how great the challenge is, simply because I am dissatisfied with the quality of science and the extent to which I see scientists who've become political scientists and on the other side, those denying change at all. What we know is that there is some warming. There is an increase in greenhouse gases. That also has a side benefit, often in improving agricultural productivity in the areas where there's plenty of water. But 67% of the Earth's surface is covered by oceans. And there has been very little satisfactory science developed on what do the oceans do in absorbing and the rest of it in the process. To what degree does that offset what we see? How much different does the melting of the ice of the glaciers in Greenland matter as you see suddenly increase in ice in the Antarctic or in some other remote parts of the world? So this is clearly a challenge that's in front of us. Here I would appeal to my understanding of the Hippocratic Oath for the medical profession, do no harm. And as the government sets out to try to be visible doing something, that I hope there is a careful measurement in what they do, that we do not end up doing more harm than the greenhouse gases. The change that I have followed with intense interest over the last 20 years has been in the economic side. And here I have viewed it largely as an opportunity. As we've moved away from individual nations and their barricades to trade, to international groups, the most successful being the European Union, now spread to some 27 countries with several others potentially joining. NAFTA for this continent, Mercosur, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Brazil in the southern hemisphere, and then still undeveloped, ASEAN, long-standing Association of Southeast Asia nations, very successful grouping. Still unclear what will be the larger Asia economic trading cooperative. Will it be Asia only, or will it be Asia Pacific, including Canada, the US, Mexico, Chile as partners? Now, what's changed dramatically in the last 18 months are the repercussions of the extraordinary financial meltdown and now the deep recession that we're in. Suddenly, Europe's attention has been diverted from how much more do they expand and how do they change the governance structure to how do they deal with increasing signs of nationalism as individual countries move to protect their own stake as opposed to sustaining the free flow of goods, services, money that had been the fuel of the economic union. Buy America attached to the stimulus package scared the rest of the world that we were indeed headed back off in that same direction. And I'll come back to this as I make my geographic tour. Looking first at Canada, pretty stable government now for a number of years under Steve Harper, conservative. He doesn't actually have a voting majority, but he's managed to hold together enough votes to govern. Improved relations with the US broadly on a wide range of issues. But where Canada probably has the most interest to us over the medium term is on the issue of energy independence. I would make the assertion to you that US energy independence is a goal that cannot be achieved. North American energy independence. If you develop the oil sands in Canada and can get Mexico to bring in the technology to refurbish their fields and grow, a North American energy independence from the rest of the world could be achieved. Huge question out in front of us. In Mexico, the attention right now isn't on reviving the energy industry, permitting foreign investment. It's on how to cope with the drug wars. President Calderon squeaked into office with 40,000 votes. It's actually pretty remarkable. This should have been the time that the old institutional Revolutionary Party reassumed control after 6 years of President Fox, but they put up a weak candidate. The race turned out to be between very much to the left candidate, former mayor of Mexico City, strongly financed and supported by Hugo Chavez. And when he lost, he didn't want to accept it, called out his troops in Mexico City, blocked traffic for months, and wore out his welcome. And by the time Calderon finally took office in the 1st of December, they were ready for change. Almost immediately, he undertook a very dramatic action, calling out the army to try to deal with the drug problem. Recognizing that the local and national police had been so corrupted, and many of the state officials by that great flow of drug wealth, he invoked the army. The problem you got is that there are 5 different cartels fighting greed to control the trade. So much money is at stake. And he brought out the army to try to bring it under control. Mixed results to date, at least. That has enabled them to clean out a lot of the corruption in the national police, begin to try to rebuild there. My greatest worry had been that that vast wealth would turn toward trying to corrupt the army. And we have seen recently, they're very alert to this. And we've seen recently where they elected, I'll finally get it right, third try, arrested 7 members of the army who were tipping off the cartels about potential raids. So the danger is there. Not clear that they're close to having the problem solved, but we are getting close to the midpoint in President Calderon's term. As you go south, Colombia under Uribe has done a very good job of trying to roll back the control of the M19 guerrillas. They continue to get much of their support from Venezuela, and most of the arms flow across Venezuela that sustain them. But they've had a lot of defections in the past 2 years. So they're not as strong as they were even 4 years ago. But as you look more broadly, Brazil is a success story. Chile is a success story. Beyond that, lots of big question marks. In Chile, President Bachelet is the 3rd president now elected after Pinochet. First was conservative. The last 2 have been to the left of center. But she's continued, President Bachelet has continued support for the free market process. Chile remains a good place to do business, and they're getting through this current recession in pretty good shape. In Brazil, those of you who listened to me a few years ago when Lula da Silva was running for office, that'll be now, 6 years ago, I was wringing my hands about this long-term leftist labor leader and what was going to happen to Brazil. Well, it turns out he has been more effective at implementing the free market policies of his predecessors than they ever were. And Brazil is now seeing a long period of sustained growth. Even in this current downturn, they're going to grow somewhere 3.5–4% this year in the process. And increasingly, Lula da Silva has been willing to begin to try to offset the influence of Hugo Chavez in the rest of Latin America. The closest adherents to Chavez, success in electing the president in Bolivia, success in Ecuador, barely missed in Peru, and of course, obviously, close to the Castro brothers in Cuba. With success at the ballot box, mostly the peasantry, Chavez has steadily accumulated power. It has all the trappings of a dictatorship. He's there if he wants to stay for life. The only promising news I have to offer you about Venezuela is that there's pretty good evidence that he and his extended family have moved a vast amount of money offshore into accounts in the Caymans, the Bahamas, and Switzerland. So they obviously aren't planning to stay there forever. In going across the South Atlantic, we've now had another transition of power in South Africa. This, the third election since apartheid came to its end. You had a remarkable 5 years that brought about by, I'm suddenly again, you can see the age sign, I'm grasping for names, Mandela. I think history is going to card Mandela a great place for his moving from 20 some odd years in prison to a peaceful transition and a government that was amazingly absent of corruption. His principal deputy, Mbeki, did a decent job his first term, but it began to go downhill in his second term. Part of the problem was his relying on a health minister whose public announcements were that the treatment for HIV/AIDS were beetroot and ginger. I'm serious in the process. And that led to a vast increase in spread of disease, major impact on much of the professional staff, the teachers, the staff people who became infected in larger numbers. Zuma, who is the newly elected president, is a populist, noted for his multiple wives and for his deep involvement in corruption over a long period of time. Not clear what he's going to do, how he will lead South Africa going forward, but I focus on it because South Africa is the only potential leader south of the Sahara for helping move Africa on a more positive course. You look back from a historical perspective, and the Western powers share much of the blame. They divided Africa along resource lines, what they have wanted to support their economies, without any consideration of tribal, ethnic, religious considerations. And so you have boundaries that incorporate people who have great difficulty coming together for effective governance. So there is no easy or simple solution to their multiple problems. North of the Sahara, there are a couple of promising notes. First, in Morocco, transition to much younger king now, almost 6 years ago. The evidence of change, he's lightened the restrictions within the country. It's not approaching a democracy, but there is a good deal of more individual freedom. But for me, the most impressive sign, last winter, just as the celebration of Ramadan, the Muslim world came, he sent a significant number of moderate imams to each city in Europe where there was a significant Moroccan expatriate population to preach no violence. And for the first time in years, there was no violence in the cities at the end of Ramadan. That's the first Arab leader that I've seen who's been willing to dispatch moderates to argue against the violence that we see so often, in fact, promoted by the more extreme clerics. In Libya, the influence of the younger generation. Gaddafi's number 2 son persuaded his father that Libya was on a spiral downward that was going to get much worse unless they totally changed direction. Make peace with the West, compensate for the Berlin discotheque bombing, compensate for the Pan Am 103 shoot down. That got underway. In the middle of it, solid evidence came into hand of the shipment of nuclear materials and technology from Pakistan for a Libyan nuclear weapon. When confronted, son's advice, Gaddafi gave it up. We sent ships, airplanes to pick it all up, take it away. The end result, technicians have flowed back in. Oil fields in Libya have been refurbished. Their productivity is way up. New fields are being developed. Average prosperity of the citizens in Libya have gone up. Doesn't mean democracy is anywhere near, but at least a much more enlightened leadership. I wish I could offer you the same promise next door in Egypt, but unfortunately, Mubarak also wants to do this hereditary handoff to a son in the middle 30s. He's been the president now since Sadat was assassinated. That's what, 78? Not clear that the son has the capacity to effectively govern, even if they could rig an election to get him in place. Moving north to Europe, the economy, the general condition of the economy has sort of cast a shadow over everything else. But there are some very significant structural changes. The effort to develop the European Union, to have a constitution, the so-called Lisbon Treaty, they've got to get Ireland to vote again, since they voted it down the first time, and all the countries have to approve. But it looks like a deal has been struck to at least take it to the Irish voters again, with a few concessions to help. There would then be a president of the European Union, and there would be a foreign minister, strengthening those two elements. Sarkozy has returned France to the NATO military structure, from which France has been absent since de Gaulle withdrew them and kicked out NATO back in '58. And there is much less competition between what will the European Union do and what will NATO do. Clearly, there is still an issue of will there be a standing European Union military force, and if there is, who will do the planning for it? Will they get the logistic support? Not resolved, but not as heated a topic as it appeared to be as recently as 2 years ago. Big issue in front of NATO and expansion is the Ukraine and Georgia. And because of the reality of Article 5, which says attack on ones and attack on all, my guess for you is that neither the Ukraine nor Georgia will be invited into NATO. Larger issue is, will Turkey be invited into the European Union? Turkey has been the link to the East. They've been a very reliable member of NATO from its founding. But as they've moved increasingly toward an Islamist-led government, there is a revisiting within Turkey of whether the cost for trying to get into the European Union would be too high. French and the Germans have been the prime opposition. This is, until there is a president, leadership rotates every 6 months. And for the 6 months beginning in 1 July, it's the Prime Minister of Denmark, and he has put trying to reopen moving Turkey into the Union at the top of his list. My own view is that it would be a great plus for not only Western Europe, but for NATO as well, if, in fact, Turkey were brought into the Union. If they don't, if they're not admitted, over time, I think you're going to see the ties of Turkey to Europe begin to weaken as they turn more toward the Middle East and their view of a friendlier reception for their future. Russia, I hope I'm not being overly optimistic, but I think I see some signs of friction between Putin and his protege, Medvedev, serving as the president. It's one thing just to switch jobs, but not to switch who's supposed to have power. And Medvedev was very patient, subservient, But when the economy tanked, he suddenly saw that somebody had to take the blame, and he was perfectly happy for the prime minister to take the blame for the economic performance and to turn his attention to what he statutorily has authority over, foreign affairs and the military process. Made a lot of promises about investment, built 5 or 6 aircraft carriers over time, refurbished the armed forces significantly, moving toward, a little bit toward their counterpart for an all-volunteer force, having observed that it works well in the U.S. and their continued conscription process doesn't work well. But the reality is that while they still have very large foreign currency reserves, and remember, just 11 years ago, they defaulted on their international debt. The great run-up of oil, hugely beneficial. Putin very successfully reasserted state control over virtually all of the oil industry, all the energy industries in the process. But you begin to see the real impact of the drop in prices. When Gazprom has recently announced that they have postponed building the major pipeline from Siberia down to China, eager to be a dedicated customer. They're focused on trying to make sure that there isn't an alternate path to Europe from the Central Asian nations that would reduce European dependence on Russian gas. The trip into Georgia had multiple purposes, but likely one of those was they went in and sat right on the pipeline that went through Azerbaijan, across Georgia, into Turkey for shipment. And it's through that same locale that the prospective new pipeline that would have gone from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, across the same path under the Caspian, and then under the Black Sea into Bulgaria, bypassing Russia entirely. It's been much harder to raise the money to build that pipeline since Russia parked over the site with a clear sign that it could be very vulnerable even if the many billions were spent to build it. I think you will see a pretty warm welcome for President Obama when he goes for his visit. Negotiations are reasonably far advanced for the next generation of START. That treaty actually expires at the end of this year. So if there is going to be an agreement to replace it, it's time to get it in place. The terms obviously will matter a lot because verification will still be the central issue as it has been for most arms control. But probably the biggest rabbit that's out there to be pulled out of a hat would be revising the idea of a ballistic missile defense system aimed against a potential Iranian threat. Instead of radars in Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic and the missiles in Poland, to integrate with sites in Russia and maybe Azerbaijan along with the Czech Republic, and to have Russia as an actual player in the ballistic missile defense. Makes some people nervous. On the other hand, it removes the fear that this is really not really aimed at Iran, but is aimed at weakening Russia's continued deterrence. I suspect I've already, as I still do, I have trouble going back and forth between Soviet Union and Russia, and I'll just simply tell you how many years I spent in the middle of the Cold War. China remains a fascinating place to watch. Next leadership change is due in 2012. We should have seen in 2007 who the likely successor would be. It is still not clear. There's still rivalries between President Yu and his predecessor, Jiang. those who left China at the time of Tiananmen, who came to the U.S., a number of them are pretty successful in the investment banking world and real estate in New York and Los Angeles, still want to go back. They think the window of change is going to be between 2012 and 2017. They base that on the expanding middle class, which right now is the main prop for letting the Communist Party continue to dominate political control, that they will increasingly want some role in governance. Now, I can't sort out whether that's just optimism on their part about when they may see an opportunity to go back, or whether it's an accurate measure of the change. But what I am confident on is that as the Chinese leadership worries about avoiding chaos, the current financial stress, they want to see that middle class continue to expand. And the heart of that middle class ability to expand is access to the U.S. marketplace. Our own economy is deeply intertwined because the reality that the Chinese are the largest holder of U.S. treasuries. Part of it is they don't have any better place to go park that great wealth they earn at the U.S. market. But if they believed they were being deprived, the barriers were going up, they would find other places to move that wealth in the process. And they would deploy it pretty quickly, looking at anything that would let their economy continue to expand and to grow the middle class. They worry much less about the workers. They're not the ones who potentially could lead political change. Japan, about to go through what could be a very traumatic change, except for 11 months, ever since the early 50s, the LDP has governed in Japan. They lost the upper house last year, and they're at the edge of losing an election that's got to be called before next year and lose control of the lower house. Now, the Democratic Party, which would purportedly put together coalition government, is not in great shakes itself. The leadership has been shaken because two of the assistants of the current leader, Ozawa, were caught taking money from political contributions from industry, which was the long-term game in the LDP. They're simply getting on that same gravy train to support their political activities. The LDP has been a very staunch ally for the U.S., very strongly holding to the Mutual Defense Agreement. Not clear that the LDP would be similarly dedicated. But as you look at that change, what you have to watch closely is what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea's economy continues to do better than most in this economic turmoil. But increasingly, when you test how do the South Koreans feel about the North, they are not eager for reunification. They saw how much it cost West Germany to absorb East Germany. And they're worried that the price tag would be even higher and that it would be a major disruption on their own economy. Whether that prospect of any kind of reunification is going to appear is obviously a big question mark right now. I believe the evidence is solid that there is a transition underway in North Korea of the military leadership. Most of the leaders, some were still a holdover from Kim Il-sung. The others were put into their position as the successors by Kim Jong-il. Now, as that transition automatically creates some anxiety, because that's the strongest single stabilizing factor within North Korea. The dear leader had a stroke last fall. There are signs that his health is increasingly fragile. He has now designated his third son, 28-year-old, as his successor. And this week, the first evidence that he has handed over control of the internal intelligence services to the son. That was the route his father played in grooming Kim Jong-il to be the leader. But in that case, the transition took 15 years. In this case, because of his health, it could come much faster. What that means is, we know through history, when there is uncertainty about control inside a country, looking for external threats or involvement is the fastest way to try to unify the country behind you. And so it makes the threats that we're reading from North Korea have a deeper significance. This may not be just propaganda, but a willingness to, in fact, inflict significant military damage on South Korea. They would not have to use a nuclear weapon. They have enough uranium to have created a nuclear device, but it isn't clear to me that they're yet able to weaponize it. But they've got enough missiles with conventional arms right near the DMZ that they could devastate Seoul within hours of the touching off of a conflict. If North Korea stays nuclear, and there is a change of government in Japan, you will likely see a move on the part of Japan of wanting to be less reliant on the US umbrella and more likely for Japan to go nuclear itself. Looking at the clock, things are going reasonably stable in Southeast Asia. Relationships with India, the US, are at the best they've been in my lifetime. The success in the Congress Party in winning a significant re-election victory a couple of months ago says that that continued improving relations is likely to be sustained. Indians are trying to be helpful in Afghanistan, which worries Pakistan a lot. Obviously, the biggest challenge here is Pakistan. This week, for the first time, the Army has moved very significant forces away from the Indian border to go over and be involved in this crackdown in Waziristan that they're about to get underway. So it makes it appear that it is real, that they have decided at the top that the internal fundamentalist threat in Pakistan is a greater near-term threat than India. Unfortunately, their forces are trained for an all-out ground conflict with India, and they're taking that same approach to dealing with the Taliban in the northern frontier area and in Waziristan. So they're leaving behind large numbers of refugees not well cared for. Not sure that that's going to enable a more secure Pakistan over the longer term. I continue to worry the collapse of a government in Pakistan, particularly if it shifted dramatically to the far right, could end up making nuclear weapons available to terrorists. That for me is the single. North Korea might sell them. A very Islamist government in Pakistan might simply make them available. Afghanistan, we got whole new leadership in place as of Friday a week ago. We're going to see a shift from standard ground force attacks to special forces approach to try to wean the local population away from the Taliban. Not clear that there are enough numbers to do it. So the next year is very critical of whether there's any prospect of leaving a stable Afghanistan. You're going to see an election in August. Everything being rigged by Karzai to try to get back in. He was the best possible candidate when he was put in the office, but he's surrounded by corruption. The Afghan people increasingly are disaffected with this form of government as they see it, so it's a tortuous path. In Iraq, we will be out of the cities by the end of this month, but we're seeing a surge in bombings, clearly designed to try to touch off sectarian conflict between the Sunni and the Shia. So it is a nervous time, not necessarily unstable, but nervous. But it could deteriorate pretty fast. Right now, the troops are all slated to be out, including all the support forces, 2011. Listening to those who are pretty well attuned and have followed this problem for a long time, they think we're not going to see much change till the elections next January. If a stable government evolves from those elections, then we will likely see some renegotiation on continued U.S. presence when the exit might occur. I'd simply remind you, Korea was my beginning. Troops are still there. We're still in Bosnia, still in Kosovo. Notwithstanding all of the guarantees that we're going to be out of Iraq by 2011, I remain somewhat skeptical, unless we're going to leave total chaos behind. No reasonable prospect of an Israeli-Palestinian agreement anytime in the near term. Not clear that President Abbas could deliver the Palestinians. He can't deliver Hamas in Gaza. And Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want an agreement in the process, an independent Palestinian state. So there'll be a lot of pressures, but I'm skeptical if there'll be much progress. Good news in Lebanon with an election that surprised by returning to power those who've governed since Hariri was assassinated. Diminished seats for Hezbollah and their allies. But Hezbollah remains has a very strong military wing, very well equipped by Iran. And the big issue is what over time happens to that military force. Will they be incorporated in the Lebanese army? And the army is not sure they want them. If not, how do you sustain and keep them from, again, becoming an active terrorist activity in that part of the world? Hamas continues to be strongly supported by Iran. It used to be $40 million a month for Hezbollah, $10 million a month for Hamas. That Hamas figure has tripled subsequent to the last military operation, plus a large amount of relief money flowing in. I'm moving in this to my last topic, and that is Iran. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards, deeply involved in training and equipping Hezbollah in Lebanon, in training and equipping Hamas in Gaza, heavily involved in the provision of explosive devices that have generated more than half of our casualties in Iraq, now engaged in providing explosive devices to the Taliban in Afghanistan, leaping over the Shia-Sunni differences. There is some evidence, not as comprehensive, that they're also involved in the drug trafficking that flows from Afghanistan across toward Western Europe. So the big issue for me is who controls the Revolutionary Guards? Are they increasingly a power of their own right? And I would remind you of an episode last summer when the Iranian Revolutionary Guards sent some fast speedboats out to circle a U.S. Navy ship in the Gulf. A warning. if they wanted to precipitate a conflict with us, the fastest approach would be to go to do attack of shipping in the Gulf. Who do they report to? Allegedly to Khamenei, Supreme Commander. Not to anybody else, not to the president. Now put that in context of the upheaval we've seen the last 10 days. Election results the last week, which folded into a much more open political debate than we've witnessed since the revolution in '78. And then when it was so obviously stolen. It'd be one thing if they'd just taken 52 or 53%, but to claim a 2/3 majority for a very unpopular figure in most of the country defies credibility. But Khomeini has now put his full stamp of approval that it was a legitimate election, that there were minor changes, and they will use all force to crack down on any dissent. Now, they're not using the IRG. They're using their subsidiary, the Basiji, who are thugs. And they've used them before, 10 years ago, to crack down on the students at Tehran University. And I'm told they're out today in full force for the effort of the demonstrations that they tried to put together this morning in front of the Iranian parliament. So it's a very uncertain picture. But it is the first time we've seen a major challenge. Figure to watch for is former President Ayatollah Rafsanjani. He was very close to Khomeini, was elected president, served 2 terms, got extraordinarily wealthy during those 2 terms. That's the prime detriment to his influence because the corruption was so obvious. He's now the chairman of the 2 councils, Guardian Council, that on one hand validates the vote, but on the more important one, the one who decides who should be the supreme leader. He's been in Qom the last week trying to generate support from enough Ayatollahs to, in fact, vote out the incumbent. He needs about 45 votes. He's got 20, 25 at this point in time. Doesn't look very promising that he will get the majority, but that's the one place where you could see peaceful change. If that doesn't occur, then it will be harsher. I do not expect any government that comes along will give up their pursuit, certainly of nuclear power, and probably not of nuclear weapons. They're close and they want to have them, not to give them to terrorists, but to make sure that no other country uses military force to keep them pursuing their goal of creating a Shia caliphate. Iran, Iraq, south of Baghdad, Bahrain, the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the West Bank, southern Lebanon. Stay tuned. At that point, let me stop. I apologize, 5 minutes late, and turn to questions. Who would like to get them started? We got about 25 minutes still. Anybody willing to, where I left you confused? Yes, Steve.
Can you discuss this administration's relationship with Cuba and what you see?
Discuss administration's relationship with Cuba, where it's going to go. My answer will end up being very long-winded. Because here I got a surprise. I didn't think Fidel would hand over power till he'd die with the power. The fact that he handed it over his brother was a surprise. Even a greater surprise was to find that for 5 years before, Raul had been sending some of the brightest young colonels and brigadier generals abroad to study how other countries were improving their economies and growing. To his brother's unhappiness, he has made some significant changes. There are no longer black markets for agriculture. Farmers markets now openly exist. You can have money, and you don't have to hide it in the mattress. But there's nothing approaching democracy. But anyway, there is change. My own view is that when the Soviet Union collapsed and stopped their $4 million a day subsidy. We should have immediately canceled the embargo and begun flooding investment into Cuba so that we would have a major influence at the succession. That's what Chavez has done in the absence. So right now, on our current path, we have relatively little influence inside. I believe we would be far better served to get rid of the embargo, to embark on significant investment in agricultural change. We're not going to dislodge their political structure until they're ready to change it. It's a Cuban issue, not one for us. But if we want to have influence on that, we need to be on the ground with significant impact on their economy. Not a popular view, particularly if I were to give that speech in South Florida. Yes, sir.
Would you expand on your comments on terrorism in the United States this year, the risk of that?
Questions expand on terrorism in the U.S. I know very little, so most of what I'm going to give you is pure speculation. But I watch signs. We've seen substantial concern focused on Minnesota of second-generation Somali youngsters being recruited to go to Somalia to be trained and to return. We've seen some of the same. We don't have all that many Yemeni refugees in this country, but there are some, and we've seen the same trend. So you worry about clearly focusing on immigrant communities in the U.S., trying to find second generation, third generation who consider that they're have-nots, and to recruit them and then to send them back as potential sleepers. Now that appears to be cold racial profiling, but it's based to some degree on what's happened in Britain, where it's the second and third generation Pakistanis that have been at the heart of the attacks over the last 4 years and the planning for several which were aborted. The most optimistic news is that there has been substantial success in successfully targeting a number of the Al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan. Can't get near the top two. Evidence that the number three really would like to get out of the job because he considers it too hazardous. And a number of the others, including two who were directly involved in planning attacks inside the U.S., have been eliminated. How much that will have disrupted, hard to say. I pose the questions and can't get a good answer. What is the strategy now in Al-Qaeda? How much of it is top-down planning to be implemented? How much of it is from decentralized activities, planning it and sending it up for approval and for money? My sense is that the latter has become the major danger in front of us, but I can't find hard evidence to prove it. My worry about something this year is purely looking at patterns in the absence of evidence. They understand clearly from the pattern of the previous attacks that in this long period we take to confirm new appointees, and every time you get the new one, then you go back and start planning all over again. Bush administration began looking at Al-Qaeda and what to do about it in late January 2001. And every time a new appointee was confirmed, the process would go back and start over. And they finally had the NSC meeting to lay out the future strategy and where to up the pressure on the 5th of September, 6 days before the attack. There was a hand. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that the French and Germans are resistant to Turkey becoming a member of the EU. Can you give us one more feel for why that is, and what do you think the prospects are for that happening in the next few years?
Three different reasons. One is there is no Islamist-governed country in the European Union. They worry about that. Second, particularly Germany has a lot of Turkish nationals who've come. We're now second, third generation. They finally, this year, have begun to offer them citizenship. But for a long time, they were simply expatriates. They worry about the influence on that significant population. And the third one, Ataturk, in his dying days, told the Turkish military it was their responsibility to ensure that Turkey always remained a secular nation, never to go back to all of the corruption and trials, theological leadership of the Ottoman Empire. The army has, I know 3, maybe 4 occasions in that 70 plus years, almost 80 years, has in fact removed the government because they were becoming Islamist, and has always within a year returned power to civilian authority. The EU, led largely by Germany and France, have required the Turkish military to give up any presumption that they have the right to do that again in the process. And that's what worries a lot, particularly the elites in Turkey, that giving that up is too great a risk for where Turkey could drift with an Islamist regime. Yes, sir.
Is there, in your opinion, is there a significance of what Mexico has eased restrictions on certain drugs? I mean, is this actually happened, or?
The question is whether Mexico has released pressure on the other drugs. There is no solid evidence. There's speculation that that's occurred. What they've tried to do is to crack down on the individual cartels. And simply because, as it admitted, it was really a civil war between them. So many populations were being killed in that process. Recently, they had a successful break in the outskirts of Mexico City, and over $60 million in US $100 bills were picked up in one place, which just gives you a feel for the amount of money available for corruption in the process. So there is no favoritism between cartels that I can detect. They're aimed at all of them. They are aimed primarily because we put so much pressure on the ones that are closest to the border for fear of it spilling over across the border in the conflicts. Yes, sir.
Is there, you think, less influence in the future by Chavez with the price of oil falling, maybe less production?
The issue is there less influence by Chavez with the price of oil going down? The answer is definitely. When it was over $100 a barrel, he was just flowing money everywhere. As it got down to high 40s, he was clearly in a real squeeze. Now that it's back up into the 60s, he's probably got a fair amount of slush funds to spend. The issue is how he divides it between what he has to spend to continue to build his unilateral support inside Venezuela, and that's not inexpensive, particularly as he continues to take over whole industries to socialize them. That limits how much he's got to expend out. His support for Cuba, his support for the M19 guerrillas, but particularly his support for Bolivia and Ecuador drain a lot in the process. So it's another good reason for hoping that oil prices stay down. Yes?
I agree with you entirely on Cuba, and I've been led to believe that the older generation in South Florida may have mellowed a bit, and certainly the second generation there is ready to get it over. What would it take for us to finally
let capitalism go to Cuba and cure the problem?
I think you saw in the shift of votes to Obama in Florida, the beginning of the change. And clearly that very shrewd political machine will understand where the votes came from that made the difference for their ability to take Florida in the process. My sense is that they just got the domestic programs higher on the list. That's not that unusual. I was still serving in the first year of President Reagan. 90% of his time was on domestic issues, 10% on international. Both with the success of getting through the tax bill and other changes, his attention, but also just problems in the outside world. Problems have begun to pop up faster here. Afghanistan, Pakistan won't wait. They don't know what to do about Iran. North Korea, what do you do about that ship that they're trailing now? Do you stop it and board it? And if so, what are the consequences in the process? What does international law give you the right to do that, unless you can get the UN to show a little backbone and do a vote in the process? So all of those things, I think, simply impede getting on with solving the Cuban problem. If I had to bet, I'd say within a couple of years, we'll see the change. Happily, we're going to get some pretty good support from the agricultural lobbies to help bring about the change, because they see the prospect of a lot of good business and exports there. Yes? Questions, what about legalizing drugs? My problem, you probably could legalize marijuana without a dramatic impact, and it would have some impact on the money. The problem, my first exposure to the drug issue came from an aircraft carrier, serving on it in 1953, 52, where youngsters from the toughest parts of Los Angeles and Detroit sailed with a significant supply of marijuana. And when they got to the Far East and they'd used it up and they couldn't find any more, they moved to heroin. And they were addicted pretty fast. And then that led to, we'd had no real problems when they were smoking marijuana. When we went and they got hooked, and then all of the problems, then the violence picked up. So I have a lot of worries about the impact of legalizing. How can you create if we can't get enough peer pressure to stop the consumption broadly as it is, where's our optimism that if we legalized marijuana, that would be the boundary and that we wouldn't see significant exposure to our youngsters onto heroin, cocaine, the ones that we know have long-term severe impacts on the health, entirely aside from the violence that it. So I'm not persuaded that legalizing would get us out of this problem. It's somehow we have to dampen the enthusiasm to experiment and try.
Why does China and Russia continue to drag their feet on North Korea and even to weak support North Korea?
Question is, why do China and Russia continue to drag their feet on North Korea? First, Russia is not a major player in this. They went along with the six-party talks. They do not have significant influence inside North Korea. It's all about China. China is the prime source of their energy flow, keeps them afloat, also of food. China is really conflicted here. They have traditionally been opposed to involvement in the internal affairs of other countries because they're afraid of internal involvement by external powers in their own. And there's a long history. China, they've got fair reason to worry about that based on centuries of history. The counter problem, they're afraid that if North Korea implodes, that they'll see a large flood of refugees across the Yalu into China. And they don't want to see that at all. So that's what keeps them engaged. Here's a tough problem for the U.S. with a very different form of government, but with very deep economic ties. What position do we take with China? My own view, given the reality of our dependence on funding the debt, which we continue to pile up at an amazing rate, is we need to hug China as close to us as we can. And that causes me to be cautious about pressing them too hard to get out in other roles till we see they're ready to do it. They clearly were very upset with the second nuclear test. They told North Koreans not to do it. I think a third one might well push them into being willing to take a much stronger stand. So with the firing of long-range missiles, either over Japan or out toward, they can't reach Hawaii yet, but way out into the Pacific might have the same tack. There's a very interesting article from Henry Kissinger that's about a week old now, I think. I believe it was in the Post. That essentially takes a much harder line view on, says we can't go back to six-party talks. Those simply, trying to restore the status quo doesn't solve the problem. And that you have to be willing to take the measures to confront, to say to North Korea, you cannot be a nuclear nation. And that raises all of the prospects of conflict in the process. But it was a call for, it surprised me, it was a call for a significantly harder line. But his judgment was, what we've tried isn't working. And when it doesn't work, then you have to go back and reassess what are you willing to do. We've got time for about 3 more, I think. Yes, sir?
It occurred to me that there is another explanation for your experience on the aircraft carrier. If you had taken on a load of marijuana, you might have solved the problem.
I'm not prepared for the government to become a distributor of marijuana as part of the process. Yes.
Admiral, my question is, if you had a daughter or a granddaughter who came to you and asked you your advice about a trip that she was planning to take next year to India, how would you...
To India?
Yes, to India. And then if this daughter were adventurous and wanted to go to other less frequently traveled areas, how would you advise her in the future?
What are the less traveled areas?
Maybe South Africa?
India right now, it's reasonably safe to travel. Not always that comfortable. We've been out there, we had a son and daughter-in-law that were stationed in Mumbai with a diplomatic security service for 3 years. And they're just back. We'd been out to visit them. We know the Taj Hotel well. So it was stunning to watch that attack. But I think India's got its own element. You never know when some violence is going to pop up between the Muslims and the Hindus. I would not hesitate to let them go. They're in for shock in seeing incredible poverty underneath great wealth. And the contrast were more than I was prepared for in going out there 3 years ago. South Africa, biggest worry is criminal. Cape Town's probably okay. The game parks are okay. Careful in Johannesburg. Transit through and move on quickly. Sorry, I can barely hear you.
In Afghanistan, General Bristol taking over, what conflict do you see his accomplishing, or what's the mission, or what's the definition of mission in light of Karzai and that sort of thing?
There are there's separate problems here. A question, I'm sorry, it has to do with McChrystal taking over in Afghanistan and sort of the conduct of things going forward, in particular with Karzai. McChrystal can focus on trying to reduce local area support for the Taliban. Forces in place to stay and targeting the leadership of the Taliban and giving the rest of the population reason to believe that if they cooperate with us, they're still safe. They wanted that we suddenly leave and they get killed because they collaborated. McChrystal can't have any impact on the election or on the corruption. Whether the U.S. can at all is, for me, a big question. But that's Eichelberry, who's a retired Army Lieutenant General who had previously been in Afghanistan. He's now there as the ambassador. In beginning his ambassadorial duties, he met earlier this week with some of the opposition candidates, and it was immediately denounced publicly by Karzai and his colleagues for having decided to back opposition to Karzai. What Karzai is saying is, if he can run as an anti-US candidate, that may offset the corruption process. So it's going to be, the election's in August. It's going to be a pretty convoluted period. But McChrystal's real problems are in trying to establish basic security in the provinces, as they successfully did in Iraq, before you finally turn to the capital city. I think we have time for one last, maybe.
Can you comment on China's military buildup and modernization of their army, and whether we should consider it a threat, or the oil fields of the Middle East?
No, I don't consider China a threat to the oil fields in the Middle East. Let me end at that one at the end. To crack down on Tiananmen Square 20 years ago, the political leadership was worried about whether the military station in Beijing would act. So they brought in troops from the hinterland and they crushed the rebellion. The reward for that, and to keep the loyalty of those who weren't employed in Beijing, was to increase dramatically financial support. Back in '78, when Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping embarked on letting the economy bloom, they downgraded support for the military to fourth priority from first. Military said they couldn't survive. They were told, go get in business. They did. Much of the pirating took for 20 years were from the PLA created companies. When they got out of hand and used some of that money to get involved in U.S. politics, that was pulled back. But by that point, they were already investing more than 10% a year. What that's produced over 20 years is a vastly improved military, but it's still, at best, a regional military capability. They have not expanded their intercontinental forces. They have not yet invested in forces that could be successfully deployed at significant distances from the Chinese mainland. It is largely, at this point in time, a protective force for China and all of its nationalist views. Now, if they sustain that, where's that going to go in 10 years and 20 years? They continue that pace of investment. It will become an even more capable force. There's now evidence that they're considering wanting an aircraft carrier to sort of kiss. India's got one. They're more focused on what India has and does than what we do, because they still consider India potentially a threat. Let me end it by twisting my response to one thing I forgot to do. And that's to watch. We had the first meeting in Russia 2 weeks ago of Russia, China, India, Brazil, the four leaders, the BRIC powers. Didn't accomplish much, except start a dialogue. But if you think about trying to produce international law to deal with pirates, to deal with a whole array of challenges in front of us, to redo the non-proliferation treaties to hopefully make them more effective than this existing treaty has been, to reform the UN. You got to have new structures. You can try to hold together NATO, you can try to hold together the alliances in the Pacific, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, US. You really need Russia, China, India, Brazil to be part of that and to be able to help fund it. So as you think about evolving things over the next 10 years, the nature of our relationships with those four, where we find, not what are all the problems, but where do we have common interest? And can we pull together dialogue about those common interests that let us deal with some larger problems? Thank you all very much for your kind time and attention.